Ooh. Hello YouTubers! My name's Willie. Welcome to my channel. Today I have for you Reaction Request 154. This is the Dark Eldar, made by Arch Warhammer, and was requested by Ideal Bigots. So, let's check this out already. 3, 2, 1, play. Bum bum. Bum bum. Dun, 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 dun.
Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer 40k lore. Today, we are going to be talking about the Dark Eldar, or, well, that's where the problems immediately begin, doesn't it?
Already?
Their name. Back in the day, they were called the Dark Eldar, simply just to differentiate them between the regular Eldar. The Dark Eldar themselves just refer to themselves as the Eldar, because as far as they're concerned, they're the only real Eldar left. As for the other Eldar, you know, the ones that wander through space on giant spaceships, they refer to them as their Dark Kin. The Inquisition and Ordo Xenos refer to the Dark Eldar as Corrupted Eldar, or Chaos Eldar, which also isn't exactly correct. Nobody really knows what to call these bastards for it to be entirely correct. I'll probably just call them Dark Eldar throughout the video because easy, but the Dark Eldar themselves would probably prefer the name Iladerith Yini Asa, which was coined by Vect somewhere in the 4th, 5th edition, I think. And I'm not going to use it because it's complicated to goddamn say, but it's a hell of a lot better than Drukhari, which is just an ass-backwards name, first and foremost. Okay, so here's a bit of fucking trivia for you. A lot of Eldar and Dark Eldar language is literal ancient Irish and Scot, like Celtic language groups. In the case of Drukhari, that would be the word Druk, or Drock, and the Old Irish Drukos, meaning evil and or bad. And you might think, like, the Dark Eldar, obviously they're evil, why do you say the name doesn't fit? Well, the Dark Eldar don't think they're evil. Like, they genuinely do not think what they're doing is a bad thing. We'll get into that more later, but they don't view that. They are so far beyond any kind of human grasp of morality, they don't even recognize the meaning of the word bad or evil anymore. So literally calling the entire race bad and or evil just seems kind of pointless to me. Then again, we all know why they're now called Drukhari, and that's because you couldn't copyright Dark Eldar, but hey, details. Anywho, the naming of the pointy-eared little BDSM lovers is less important, although I still maintain that Drukhari is a bloody stupid name, but hey, once again, let's not get too hooked on that particular nicety. Let us instead start with their quote-unquote origin story. You might already have heard of this in the Eldar video, but the basic gist of it is the Eldar, having conquered pretty much the entire galaxy with the help of the Daddy Old Ones and the destruction of the Necrons, had gotten rather complacent, shall we say. They figured that since there was nothing else left in the galaxy to actually threaten them, they might as well cut loose a little bit and really get to partying for all of those years spent slaving under the Old Ones and fighting off those evil weevil Necrons. And it started relatively innocently enough with them simply just pursuing more leisurely pursuits, like the arts, studies, and doing whatever the hell they wanted. They didn't, after all, live pretty much in a post-scarcity society, so why not? But as the decades and centuries flowed by, and things started to get boring, well, let's just say that the market share of baddragon.com rose drastically. And whilst to begin with, there was nothing particularly wrong with spicing up the old and boring love life a little bit with a glow-in-the-dark condom, there is, however, a rather large leap in extremity between said illuminescent dung covering and BDSM of a level that is entirely defined by the absence of a safe word. This then continued to escalate at what can only be described as a rather uncomfortable velocity for a very long time. To put it like this, do you know what the word formicophilia means? The Dark Eldar did, and no, you shouldn't Google that. Nor should you Google cholerophilia. Just saying, but the Dark Eldar would already know what that is. This
Okay.
eventually got so bad that it literally tore asunder the Immaterium, which is quite
I'm
the
not gonna
achievement,
look this
even if
stuff
one
up.
takes into consideration that the Eldar work differently from humans. Their feelings are far more acute than ours. They burn brighter in the warp, and, of course, there's that tiny little thing that a massive percentage of them are psychers. And we all know
Nice.
how much the Demonkinses love their little psychic snacks. And this great cataclysm that would essentially wipe out the Eldar Empire happened right in the heart of their once ever so glorious galaxy-spanning nation, tearing the literal heart out of it and murdering something along the lines of 90% of the Eldar's total population. The only survivors belonging to two groups, either the ones that were currently in the Eldar webway at the time, or the vagabonds, the gypsies of the Eldar world, the ones we know today as the Craft World Eldar.
Nice.
The resultant psychic backlash, being rather considerable in its sheer volume, tore a literal hole in the universe, which we today know as the Eye of Terror. And whilst, of course, the Eye is always flooding the galaxy with
imagine
chaotic
what a
energies,
crazy day
it
that
is
would've
considerably
been?
worse for the Eldar, since Slanesh, the horrible little deity born from the excess of the Eldar, is literally, at all times, eating the souls of every single Eldar in the galaxy. The Craft World
Nice.
Eldar have gotten around this teensy-weensy problem by supplanting their souls into magical gemstones. These are the Soul Stones. These essentially function as a prismatic containment device in which the soul can rest at peace from the vagaries of chaos. This means that the soul cannot be eaten by Slanesh, which is rather important, since being eaten by the literal god of suffering and excess is probably not a particularly good fate. And it
Probably
also
not.
prevents the Eldar soul from being lost upon death. Normally, when you die, your soul flies into the Immaterium. The soul of your average human isn't really an entity that has any kind of agency in the warp. It is not something that has a mind of its own, so to say. It is an etheric shadow of your former self. You, as a human, for example, will not live, quote-unquote, in the warp. You won't go to, well, hell, which is what the warp essentially is at that point. Instead, a shadow version of you will be sent in there. The shadow version won't be able to, feel pain or have any real kinds of feelings or sentience at any real level, and as such, it isn't really too much of a bother for a human. Think of it like this. If the minor demons are essentially sharks, then the soul of a human would be something along the lines of a shrimp.
Nice.
Whilst the soul of a psyker might be something more along the lines of, say, a dolphin. A creature capable of certain cognitive functions, and being able to realize that it is well and truly fucked upon entering into the Immaterium. Hell, it might even survive for a short amount of time before the sharks nom it, but it's rather unlikely. In the case of an Eldar, however, well, that would be something like this. Imagine a very large tank filled with blood-crazed sharks with massive bad dragon dildos hanging off their nethers that all have enough intelligence to make you suffer long and terrible before you die, and then have said human tied up hanging by a rope that is slowly fraying above said shark tank. You have absolutely no idea how long the rope is going to last. The only information you have is the slow snapping and unraveling sounds. Furthermore, the water is dark. You have no idea what's down there, but you know it's going to be really, really bad. That is how an Eldar soul would feel in the warp. Thusly, you can probably understand why the Eldar would do anything and everything to avoid this particular fate. That, in the case of the Craftful Eldar, would of course again be the Soul Stones, which essentially binds the soul within its own little prismatic prison. This is then usually kept inside of the craft worlds and kept safe from any external stimuli. This allows the souls of the Eldar to essentially communicate with each other over the prismatic network. It's not as cool as being alive, but it's definitely a hell of a lot better than being dead. But of course, if the Soul Stone should be destroyed, well, Then the soul goes flying off into the warp, and see the previous example with the tank for more information on what happens next. The obvious question then becomes, why are the Dark Eldar not using this very same technology? Well, they were insulated to a degree by being within the webway, but the webway, of course, is, you guessed it, inside the warp.
Yeah.
The Eldar on the craft worlds were insulated by good old-fashioned distance, which proved a hell of a lot more effective. The warp, of course, is everywhere and nowhere at once, which means that their distance could, of course, be infinite, but it could also be right next door. And just as it happened in this particular case, it was right next door. The Soul Stones simply don't work on the Dark Eldar. They don't have enough of a soul left to protect within the Soul Stones. What they have is constantly being eaten away by Slaanesh. This process will take decades, possibly even centuries, but eventually the Eldar will shrivel up into a cold, dead, dry husk. And the soul of the poor little Dark Eldar, well, let's say it like this. Slaanesh is very fond of Eldar souls. He has special things in store for Eldar souls, but Dark Eldar souls, ooh, that is an even more prized commodity.
Oh, yeah?
For the Dark Eldar have steeped themselves in pain and suffering and excess for possibly thousands of years extra. They are an absolute delicacy to Slaanesh. To use another deviant sexual comparison, which is probably going to be a staple of this video, I am talking about the Dark Eldar after all. A craftwall Eldar soul would be a fleshlight, probably better than using your hand, but nothing special. A Dark Eldar soul, however, now we're talking $7,000 territory, real doll level quality. There is just no compare. As such, you can imagine, Slaanesh has a vested interest in gathering as many little Dark Eldar souls as chaotically possible. In fact, you will find the Slaaneshi demons go well and truly out of their way to find themselves these most delicious little morsels. And as you can probably imagine, the Dark Eldar take a very, very different view. They would rather not be eaten by Slaanesh for as long as Eldarly possible, and they will do anything and everything to avoid it. And luckily for them, the soul is not an infinite product. Slaanesh can't simply nom at them for eternity. They will eventually turn into husks. Realizing this, the Dark Eldar figured, hold on a minute, if our bodies are essentially a container for the soul, and the body can eventually run out of soul, maybe, just maybe, there is a way to top off the glass to refill our souls? And so they began experimenting, realizing rather quickly that the best way of replenishing their own souls was to feed upon the souls of others. And now again we return to the good old-fashioned theory that in the warp, the more extreme the emotion, the better. In other words, to get as much of a refill as possible, the Dark Eldar would have to do something as extreme as possible. Well, luckily for the Dark Eldar, they had a lot of training in being extreme. But of course, the extraction of suffering is, well, it's a complicated business, really. Generally speaking, you won't feel too many people volunteering to have suffering extracted from them. It's generally not a very pleasant work thing. In the slightest, really. Even less so when it comes to the Dark Eldar. In other words, the Dark Eldar would have to wander off into the galaxy and find somebody else they could make suffer. And as previously mentioned, most living creatures are not particularly fond of suffering, and in the vast majority of circumstances, they will resist anybody who tries to kidnap them specifically for the purpose of torturing them for as long as Dark Eldarly possible. And I would just like to point out real quick that the Dark Eldar have gotten very, 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 very good at making things live for a very, very, very long time, regardless of what they do to it. We then have ourselves a little bit of a dilemma. One, the Dark Eldar would like to find something, preferably something squishy that screams really loudly and is capable of heightened emotions, to torture very, very slowly over an extended period of time.
Which means
Secondly,
other
whatever
Eldar?
thing exists in the galaxy that is squishy, capable of screaming very loudly, and capable of fully understanding the horrible things that is being done to it, well, they are unlikely to volunteer. In fact, they are quite likely to resist this with every single piece of equipment they can get their filthy little pink paws on.
Yeah.
So, the only solution then is to convince the little creature that it needs to come along. And considering what's waiting for it, you can't do this verbally, can you? Hell, even threatening it with violence is probably relatively ineffective because it would probably prefer to be shot, to be honest. Which means you need to capture them relatively alive, which is a bother. Can you imagine dragging something like that all the way back to Komorog, kicking and screaming, trying to escape, trying to kill you in your sleep and stuff? It's just not particularly useful, is it? It's downright bothersome, if you ask me. Then, the Dark Eldar came with a third option. Now, they only need to be around in relative close proximity to enjoy the restorative powers of people screaming really loudly in agony. Why then not simply launch large-scale raids into real space out of the webway in which Komorog is located to find many squishy, screamy things, raid them, bully them for an extended period of time, and then simply leave. After all, once the Dark Eldar are fully regenerated, they can live comfortably for a fairly considerable amount of time before having to do this whole thing again. And it's also important to note that they live off suffering, all kinds of suffering. For example, the various Vich cults in Komorog will put on massive displays of gladiatorial combat where the wealthiest in Dark Eldar society will go to feed off the suffering of the poor motherfuckers thrown into the arena with the witches. There's also several other ways to gain suffering whilst in Komorogian society. They don't have to do raiding, but many do so because it is the most effective. There's also, of course, the obvious advantage of being able to gather slaves, whilst having the strength of numbers to contain said slaves, and, naturally, acquiring slaves, acquiring suffering, and acquiring certain choice slaves, like, for example, children. Yeah, I know, it's getting a little bit dark here, but children scream louder than adults, apparently, and their suffering is more visceral. Again, I know, dark as fuck, but we are talking about the dark goddamn Eldar here, so yeah, it is to be expected. And these things can of course be sold for vast quantities of good old-fashioned cash within Dark Eldar society. Because they do have a society, they don't purely trade in suffering. That cash can of course be used for good old-fashioned food, because they need that as well. They don't actually live off the soul-feeding thing, it just prevents them from being eaten by an Eldritch deity who wants to butt-sex their souls to death over the course of 17 millennia.
Nice.
Additionally, of course, if you are a literally thousands of years old murderous psychopath, you have certain, vices. And these vices frequently require large quantities of cash to satisfy. So, raiding is a rather integral part of Dark Eldar society.
So they're just
but,
always raiding?
Of course, there is one teensy-weensy problem. As I mentioned previously, whatever you are trying to raid, well, it's relatively likely to try to defend itself. Which means that the Dark Eldar might find itself on the wrong side of a very, very large shotgun, which might prove unfortunate for even the Dark Eldar. They do have fairly competent body armor technology, but, you know, you can always get unlucky, and when things are scared absolutely shitless about being tortured to death, it is surprising how much damage even the squishiest of moon kegs can do to the Dark Eldar physique. Not to mention, the Eldar being, Eldar, are not exactly particularly sturdily built. Their brittle little bones break fairly easily. In other words, casualties are pretty much unavoidable unless they are picking on the most civilian of targets, and even then, in this day and age of 40k, there are very, very few civilian installations that do not have at least a basic level of PDF presence. And thusly, since the chance of catching a stray lasball to the Chrome Dome cannot be entirely removed from the equation, the Dark Eldar had to figure out some way to reduce the risk, first and foremost, and that is why they developed the doctrine of hit-and-run raids. They wish to strike at a target and get the fuck out very, very quickly, so that any necessary medical aid can be rendered. Additionally, the Dark Eldar have gotten very, very, very good at medicine, partly because they need to keep their screaming things alive for as long as possible, and of course because they want to keep themselves alive for as long as possible. In fact, they have gotten so good at it, that they have figured out a way to essentially resurrect the dead. Now, this process only works on Dark Eldar due to their quirk of physiology and their whole little soul connection with Slaanesh and stuff. If a Dark Eldar is dead, properly dead, made into tiny small pieces and blasted across a vast area, presuming that the pieces can be gathered up and brought back up to their mothership, the homunculi can stitch the various pieces together. Now, of course, there are limitations to this. If you burn a Dark Eldar, for example, he's probably not going to come back from that, unless, of course, he's just crispy. If he's turned to ash, he's pretty much fucked, but if he's just been turned into a shriveled mummy, maybe. If he's had several limbs removed, not a big problem, we can just suture those back together, not an issue. If he has a gaping hole in him somewhere, well, depending on how many of his organs have gone poof, it might complicate matters, but the Dark Eldar are also pretty good at making artificial organs, and in any real space raid, they are going to be making damn sure to be bringing a lot of those along with them. Basically, what I'm saying is, except for the most devastating of trauma, like being squished into a pancake, a Dark Eldar can be brought back to life by the services of the homunculi. First and foremost, of course, the body needs to be stitched together. Then secondly, they are put in a special chamber, which feeds off, you guessed it, suffering. Because, of course. Essentially, it takes the pain of various living creatures and uses that pain as a battery of sort to run this Eldritch machine that regenerates the Dark Eldar in question. The more severe the damage, the more pain necessary. And, of course, since pain comes at a premium in Komaragi society, this is a highly effective, but also a ludicrously expensive way of regenerating somebody, which again means that people need to go on raids just to gather the necessary money to pay for any potential restructuring, shall we say. This ability to quite literally bring the dead back to life naturally gives the homunculus a considerable amount of power within Dark Eldar society. Not as much as they once used to hold, but they are, of course, extraordinarily important, and those who control them keep very, very close tabs on them, make sure that they are never wanting in any respect whatsoever. Now, they actually used to be the leaders of the Dark Eldar in their entirety. After the fall, the homunculi used to be the lords of Eldar kind, the most prominent of their species. In the case of these particular ones, they were the ones who avoided the fall by being inside the webway, and in Komarog in particular, when Slaanesh tore his happy little ass free from the warp and ate most of their civilization. They, of course, rose naturally to the top of Dark Eldar society and established what was basically an aristocracy. It is also said that they were the ones who first came up with how to regenerate the Dark Eldar soul, which obviously also made them very important in Dark Eldar society, and realizing this, they have not shared this secret on precisely how to do it with anybody else.
Greedy.
Realizing, of course, that this knowledge will essentially make them completely untouchable inside of Dark Eldar society. If they are the only ones sitting on the secret of regenerating the Dark Eldar, well, the Dark Eldar can't kill them, regardless of what they do. They simply cannot do away with them, because if they do, well, then Slaanesh will finally finish om-nom-nomming all of their screaming little souls.
Like
and
birthday
they sure as
cake.
hell don't want that. This rather one-sided power structure would still have been in place today if it were not for the actions of a certain peasant little bastard by the name of Azarubel Vecht, who, he changed shit up rather drastically, to put it mildly. He replaced the old aristocracy of the homunculi with a rather vicious form of meritocracy, where Dark Eldar society was organized into various cabals. These would then compete against each other for, well, everything. Who could get the most slaves? Who could amass the most wealth? Who could have the most soldiers? Who could have the most control of the largest swaths of Komarog? Who could have the control of various organizations or smuggling operations, etc., etc., etc.? Dear little Vector is definitely going to get a full video on his own and his astronomic rise to power, especially considering Vector's only about 5,000 years old. Only, I know, but as far as Dark Eldar High Society is concerned, that was a relative newcomer at the time, considering that Dark Eldar Society of then was ruled by the old lords of the Old Empire, which stretches back some 10 to 20,000 years. To them, Vecht was a stripling. But he turned out to be a rather cunning stripling, if nothing else, and achieved something no Dark Eldar before him had done. But I feel he really does deserve his own video, so we won't go too much into him. Instead, let's talk a little bit more about the homunculi. They are the oldest things in Dark Eldar society, and naturally, if, Dark Eldar society being what it is, they are also the most twisted. In fact, some of them are even said to have been around when the original cults of pain and pleasure were originally founded back in the old Eldar Empire, which means that some of these motherfuckers in 40k must be somewhere along the lines of 25 to 30,000 years old. And over the course of their very, very long lives, they have developed some rather interesting fetishes, to put it mildly. They are considered, even by Dark Eldar society at large, to be a bit eccentric and a bit extreme as well. And you know that when a Dark Eldar accuses you of being a little bit over the fucking line, you have truly reached brand new territories of special. In fact, I happen to know what one of their favorite tactics is. It's to force people like you to watch ads.
I guess he was supposed to have an ad there?
That was pretty fucking diabolical of me, wasn't it? But I would like to point out one more thing. The homunculi, just like myself, are not beings of, good old-fashioned crazy town or anything. They're not insane, or, well, actually, that would not be entirely correct. They're completely and utterly batshit. Some of them, for example, might choose to only dine upon a salad of eyeballs, entrails, and berry bushes. For no particular reason, just they've decided this is what they like. Others might find that wearing bathrobes made out of human skin is just the right way to invigorate them after getting out of a shower. Others might insist on keeping small cohorts of orcs around as servants purely because they find the challenge of causing actual notable pain to greenskins to be so stimulating that they find all other forms of slaves to be utterly pointless. And seeing as the entirety of Dark Eldar society basically rests upon their creepy little shoulders, they can afford it. They essentially have no upper spending limit. They can do whatever the goddamn hell they want, because everybody has to go to them for treatments. Everybody has to go to them for regeneration, and they can simply charge whatever the fuck they want. I did mention that most of Dark Eldar society is essentially a meritocracy via the various cabals, but the homunculi are well and truly above such concerns, because the cabal will simply pay their homunculi whatever they goddamn want because they have to have them.
Makes sense.
In fact, having control over a homunculi is in itself worth virtually an infinite amount of money. It really is to the point that Dark Eldar society is so reliant upon what the homunculi sell that they are completely outside of Dark Eldar society as far as economic goes. And hell, not even economics. Dark Eldar society, believe it or not, actually does have rules. You can't just murder someone, for example. Or, well, you can, but you must have at least a basic kind of reason. You know, he did something mean to me, or I wanted his shit. I mean, that's good enough a reason. But you can't just do it for no reason. Not because there's, a police system or anything, but because if you murder somebody belonging to a cabal, then you've just essentially pissed upon that cabal's name and reputation. And in a society as vicious and violent as Dark Eldar one, that shit cannot stand. And said cabal is going to come after you, flay you, and use your skin as toilet paper. In the case of the homunculi, however, well, to put it like this, they literally have so much power and so much wealth that it would be a complete and utter suicide for the vast majority of cabals to actually go after them. And even if that wasn't the case, they would still be virtually impervious to any kind of social consequence, because Dark Eldars are scared shitless of homunculi. Yes, the race who literally lives of torturing others are scared beyond belief of these bastards. That is how frightening these little shits are. They are so utterly batshit insane, they dream up modes of torture so utterly beyond the pale that even the witch cults look at it and go, wow, not even we would touch that shit with a barge pole. And to make all of that even worse, because yes, it does actually get worse, they're not crazy, like I mentioned. They are insane, but they are fully functioning psychopaths. They are capable of organizing raids and plans of such complexity, depth, and immaculate execution that there is virtually no defense against it. That is, for example, the hive world of Auxilian, who, rather stupidly, decided to make a deal with Eldar Corsairs. They would provide them with the locations of less defended, squishier worlds, and in return, the Dark Eldar would keep the fuck away from their solar system. Unfortunately, after a few generations, the people of Auxilion became so complacent with this, they started treating the Dark Eldar with essentially disdain, as if they were their lapdogs. A remarkably bad idea. I mean, there are people in current society that choose to try and pull buses with their penises, and that decision pales in comparison to how stupid this one was. And as if just to really hammer home the point of how stupid it was, the homunculi's Kres led his own personal carnival of pain. Oh, by the way, let me explain the term carnival of pain, because while I think the word itself should be rather indicative of what you're about to hear about, I just really love the idea. It is essentially a personal army of torture victims who have been stitched up in so many horrifying forms that they make chaos demons look uniform and boring. A literal army of uncontrollable, tortured, crazed monstrosities of so many wide and varied horrifying forms that even the chaos gods would find it goddamn impressive. Releasing a carnival of pain upon a world is literally like dumping a billion angry mutated alligator lion hawks on a planet and then watching the ensuing carnage. Blood is going to be everywhere. Scorch marks, screaming, bodies, bones. It is going to be the most vicious kind of carnal world you have ever seen. And yet, 5 years later, when Imperial authorities dispatched a exploratory force to figure out why the fuck the planet hadn't said anything in 5 years, and again, the Imperium doesn't really care if a planet goes quiet, but when it stopped paying its taxes, well, it's time for investigations to occur.
Investigations.
They did not find a single goddamn shred of evidence of what had happened. Not a speck of blood, not a single bone, nor a skin cell, nor a scorch mark, or a teeth mark, or a claw mark. Not even a hair. The planet had been made utterly sterile.
Wow.
Hell, the lights were still on, the power stations were still functioning, the goddamn toilets still flushed. but not so much as a single
What direction did the water
solitary
go?
living thing. The homunculi might be crazy, but they are extremely good at what they do. In fact, let me give you this as an example to really hammer home the point, just a little bit more, if any more hammering is needed. The homunculi have actually managed to make the Night Lords afraid.
Ooh.
Yes, there's actually a story where homunculi managed to make Night Lords afraid of the dark. That is Alpha Legion level of just completely and utterly, stupidly beyond the realms of reality. But there you go. That is how insanely scary the homunculi are. And hell, I haven't even really touched upon all of it. In fact, the homunculi are probably going to get an entire video all of their own at one point because, god damn it, Games Workshop really love these little bastards. They never write any new army books for the Dark Eldar, but there's always plenty of stuff written about the homunculi, and considering everything, that is understandable. They are fantastically creepy little bastards, after all. But we must move swiftly along. Let us touch a bit upon the witch cults. Now, the witches are of course frequently used in the real space raids of the Dark Eldar, where they will attach themselves to any given cabal to find new and interesting slaves and to test out their skills in a less pressuring environment. The witches literally see real-world raids as practice, so to say, tests, where they can play with new things and new ideas that they can then later perfect and carry out in the arena. And the arena is, of course, the most important place for the witch cults. It is their temples. Each witch cult has their own arena. Their arena is their little kingdom. It is the basis upon which their entire mini-society within a society is built.
Okay.
The revenue of their arena is what feeds them, what finances them, what buys them their weaponry, their showpieces, their slaves, and of course tickets to the real space raids.
Okay.
And of course, in turn, the popularity and prominence of a given cult is based upon their arena and the shows they put on. Dark Eldar High Society will pay many monies to go see the witches do their thing, and of course feed off the new and exquisite feelings, pains and tortures presented within. And considering the price, the witches inside are of course expected to put on quite the show. You can never do the same thing twice in Commorragh. If you've beheaded the enemy, the next on you need to cut their ears off first, or pluck out their eyes, etc., etc.
Oh, man.
There always needs to be something new. And if your cult is not putting on the newest and most fashionable of shows, then you can be damn sure that somebody else is. Now, of course, these can all vary to a great degree. For example, it might be a current trend that the witches should enter into battle with only one leg, for example, to give the enemy an advantage, or that the witches should fight under the effect of a deliberating drug, for example, that makes it seem as if they are fighting fluffy puffy teddy bears who are trying to attack them with baseball bats filled with love and compassion, when in reality they're fighting a gigantic gene-enhanced monstrosity that is trying to bash the poor little witch over the head with a piece of metal piping.
Nice.
In short, the more unsettling, unlikely, unseemly, vicious, violent, brutal, and just downright uncommon a performance is, the more it'll be worth, and the more it will raise the prominence of the witch cult in question. Now, of course, this requires the services of many other parts of Commorragh as well. For example, the acquiring of some especially insane bullshit weapon might serve as a good attraction. There is a weapon, for example, that turns people and their weapons into glass, which is, quite the oddity. There is another weaponsmith that might specialize in making weapons that don't really do that much damage, but hurt a lot when they hit, like neuro whips that overload the target's pain center without actually endangering the target's life. And of course there are many Dark Eldar that have become very good at breeding large and interesting looking creatures for use as fodder in these various arenas, like for example a 6-legged, 8-armed, betoothed crocodile thing covered in spines that farts poison gas and fires tiny little needles from its mouth. And then finally, as the dot over the eye, it has a small secondary head placed right above its butthole who sings Merry Christmas.
Wow.
No particular reason, it's just insane. And that is reason enough. And of course, there is a certain level of competition between the various cults as they try to get the most interesting weapons, the most interesting mutants, the most interesting slaves, and of course, the most interesting performers. And as with most things in Dark Elder society, competition usually involves large quantities of violence. Witch cults are usually fairly large. The smallest are a few thousand individuals. The largest can basically be the size of armies.
Wow.
And can launch raids upon other witch cults to acquire new and interesting things. If a witch cult has designed a new and interesting way of killing, for example, odds are that other witch cults are going to try and copy and or take away that advantage, either through just simply stealing the technique or murdering whoever came up with the technique.
Wow.
And a particularly lucky viewer of a witch cult show might be witness to another cult raiding the cult in whose arena they're in. Most thrilling indeed. And of course,
Nice.
going to the arena is not particularly safe in and of itself. The performance quite frequently spills over into the audience, which, well, to the audience, they consider it a form of, extra spice, I suppose. They can just be regrown anyway, so why not? And really, this is kind of how they view it. Now, don't get me wrong, they will undoubtedly defend themselves, and many cults even encourage the guests to bring weapons in case it gets interesting, but this is, of course, for the high society of Komarog. The price of a ticket is, impressive, to say the absolute least, and it's not somewhere the mere ruffians of Dark Elder society can go. Oh no, the ruffians have their own arenas, but it is usually not run by the witch cults. Instead, it is simply run by gangs who like to stab one another. Which brings us nicely to Komarog itself. Now, Komarog is one of those pieces of 40k lore which is kind of difficult to nail down, because the damn thing changes every single bloody edition it's mentioned in. At one point, it was in the Warp. Then it was in the Webway. Now it's not in the Webway, it's in several Webways.
Wow.
Then it's scattered over different networks of the Webway. Now there are sub-networks of the Webway network that Komarog is in, and is constantly expanding, and yada 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 yada. The idea of precisely how Komarog works changes more often than an obsessive-compulsive person would change socks if you gave him 100 different coloured and different patterned single socks and asked him to put one on each leg. The version we're going to go with here is the most basic one, namely that the Webway can be quite varied in its size and structure. We know there are areas of the Webway that is simply just the size of a relatively small corridor, big enough for 2 or 3 people to walk shoulder to shoulder, and that's about it. Whilst we also know there are other parts of the Webway large enough to contain entire ships and even craft worlds. Now, clearly, Komarog has to be one of these because there's an entire goddamn city in there. Now, it is also possible that Komarog extends out from Komarog, so these parts of the city aren't technically parts of the city, but they are built in different areas of the Webway connected to the city. And the Dark Eldar simply considers that to be a extension of the city, rather than an entirely new city. Though, to be honest, at this point, Komarog is less of a city in the ideas of the Dark Eldar mind. It is more like their homeworld, their refuge, their very own space in reality, rather than just a city. It is their savior. It saved them from the collapse of the Empire. It is their mother who nurtures them and keeps them safe. It is their protector who allows them to stay separate from the rest of the universe, a universe who would very much so like to murder every last single solitary fucking one of them.
Yeah.
Now, it is not impossible for outside people to enter into Komarog. In fact, it has happened on several occasions. Space Marines in particular seem to pretty much just enter and leave as they please, as I don't think I know of a single time Space Marines have entered Komarog and not simply just wander their happy little power-armored asses straight back out again. So maybe the Dark Eldar should work on security, is all I'm saying, but hey, nobody's perfect. And speaking of perfection, you might be wondering, why did the Dark Eldar even need a massive fuck-off city that simply grows as the plot demands? I mean, they're a dying species, right? There can't possibly be that many of them. Well, in the good old nature of the 41st millennium, the bad guys always have a solution. And while the Eldar themselves have never really been able to get around the long gestation period of the Eldar race, the Dark Eldar figured out a way. A very Dark Eldar way.
Oh, yeah?
They would simply rip people's wombs out and start growing people artificially in massive farm complexes.
Wow.
Part of me is like, this should be relatively basic medical science for the Eldar. Now, granted, the Craftwell Eldar were considerably more backwards than their Empire Eldar cousins. They were, well, basically the gypsies of the Eldar race, the travelers, etc. So they wouldn't have access to quite the same technology, as can still be seen in the Dark Eldar and the Eldar. The Dark Eldar have weapons that fire miniaturized fucking suns, for God's sake. The technology has gone so far beyond magic level, it's gone into the hilarious territory. But surely, the Eldar must be able to do this as well. I'm wondering about the ethics and the morality behind all of this. I'm wondering what the reason for the Eldar are to not do this. I'm thinking it might have something to do with hubris. They want to keep themselves away from any kind of strong emotions, and the emotion of wanting to rebuild their race through, for example, this somewhat nasty method, I'm thinking that would probably be a rather strong emotion, considering the fact that Eldar Uthwan has been chastised for this God only knows how many times, which eventually got the Sea Council to tell him to fuck himself and wander off into the cosmos. It's not the worst explanation. The Dark Eldar, of course, have absolutely no such concerns. It might even be the exact opposite for the Dark Eldar. I heard a theory once which I thought was pretty good, but also kind of... I don't quite know. The idea was that the Eldar do not reproduce because the act itself, reproducing, having a child, and of course the fucky involved with it, was an extremely emotionally intense process for the Eldar. Now again, bear in mind, the Eldar brain functions slightly differently for the human, so it might be an even more extreme experience. The wish to protect one's child, etc., stuff like that. Now, I don't really buy it entirely, because whilst I can definitely see the pride argument, the mere act of having a child, if that is such a extreme emotion, which of course the Craftwell Eldar try to avoid, I'm kind of surprised they reproduce at all. Do they do so under very specific circumstances, very controlled circumstances, etc.? Do they just heavily sedate themselves throughout the entire thing or something?
Yeah.
Now I'm getting kind of interested. I'm going to have to look into Eldar Woohoo at some point. But again, of course, the Dark Eldar are the exact opposite. If this really does produce heightened emotions amongst the Eldar, this will basically be something the Dark Eldar would readily embrace and go for as much as humanly possible. Or, well, Eldarly possible, again. However, there is a tiny bit of a complication, namely in the fact that it's very difficult to find two Dark Eldars that are capable of sticking together with one another for an extended period of time without, one, stabbing the other multiple times, and then trying to fuck the corpse. This naturally complicates the entire process of, raising a child, or even just making one in the first place. And since, again, Eldar gestation period are long as shit, this causes several problems. Now, of course, most of these are solved by the, farms. It also fixes the whole population issue, since the Dark Eldar can simply just produce as many soldiers as they need, granted. They'll still need a rather considerable amount of time to really grow to anything worth a damn, but hey, luckily for the Dark Eldar, their very world provides the solution. You breed 1 million Dark Eldar, Then you simply upend the entire farm, dumping the poor little sods right into the slums and ghettos of Komarog. Then you wait, say, 100-odd years, and you see what floats to the top. If you just keep doing this over and over and over again, you're essentially going to create exactly what happened in Komarog. A very large, very vicious lower-class society that essentially has to fight tooth and nail against each other for the vast majority of the time for the honor of getting recruited into one of the larger cabals, and therefore, eventually, being allowed to go on real space raids and establish themselves properly within society.
Wow.
It goes without saying that the overwhelming majority of these Eldar will die in rather horrifying circumstances, and a frightening proportion of them are also probably just going to become soul dead, having their souls nom-nommed away by good old-fashioned Slanesh. But on the bright side, all of the death and suffering that happens down in the slums will eventually rise up to the top, feeding both the upper classes and the lower classes.
Nice.
If anything, Eldar lower-class society can be seen as kind of a microcosmos of how the Dark Eldar function in the galaxy as a whole, with the various smaller gangs constantly raiding one another in search for, well, prisoners and good old-fashioned pain. Do not be mistaken, though. Not all Eldar are born this way. The aristocracy, as in pretty much every single goddamn society as far as we can bloody know, the aristocracy wishes to be different from the hubbub and drumbly nonsense of the filthy, unwashed peasant masses, and as such, they tend to actually birth their children naturally. These natural-born Eldar are known as the true-born, and they are considered to have a natural higher class within Eldar society. They are kind of the pseudo-aristocracy within the otherwise very meritocratic system of the Dark Eldar cabals.
Interesting.
Now, of course, simply being a trueborn is absolutely no guarantee that you're going to be living to a ripe old age, as you're still going to have to deal with all of the other trueborn, not to mention inter-cabal fighting and all of that, but it does, at the very least, mean that you were born with access to a wide variety of heavy weaponry, and the best armor that money can buy, which undeniably gives you a hell of a lot better chances at surviving than literally just being dumped into the slums of Komarog with nothing to your name except, if you're lucky, a threadbare shirt. Come to think of it, a Dark Eldar survival sim would be fucking amazing. Just saying, that would be great. Oh god, there are so many fantastic settings within 40k, and nobody is making them. It genuinely annoys the shit out of me, it does. But of course, other Dark Eldar are not the only problem within Komarog.
Oh, it is?
You see, the webway has seen better days, to put it very mildly. It is collapsing, has been collapsing for a very long time, and Dark Eldar society as a whole is essentially living on borrowed time.
Nice.
And the webway sporadically suffers from, well, one could call them earthquakes, essentially, where the walls of the webway start moving and occasionally cracking.
Well, that can't be
when
any
this
good.
happens, demons pour through. Lots and lots and lots of them, since literally the webway is in the middle of the warp, and it is filled with Eldar, the most delicious of all morsels, Dark Eldar, to boot. It is quite the feast
Quite
for the
tasty,
dentists of
I
warp, and
imagine.
as such, if there is even the slightest crack in Komarog, demons will come flooding through in their hundreds, and expanding the crack, then in their thousands, and pushing open the door a little bit more, and then in their tens of thousands, and so on, until the Dark Eldar can eventually push them back. They do this by kidnapping psychic nulls from the other races, and once the tides of chaos has been pushed back, they place fail-safes around these cracks. The technology to repair the webway is
long gone.
Well, almost entirely lost. Essentially, the Craft World Eldar still have some very basic and exceedingly costly ways of doing so. The Dark Eldar have virtually none. The only ones who actually, researched this stuff in recent memory was Big E, and well, he's not telling anybody his secrets. Anywho, after the breach has been plugged up, they fortify it heavily, automated sentry turrets, massive barricades, meters upon meters of plasteel, etc., and then they place psychic nulls in cages around the area. Now, the nulls, of course, are the primary defense. The rest is, well, mostly for show. It's going to delay a demonic invasion by an hour or two tops, but when you're talking demon invasion, every second does count. At the end of the day, though, all of this are stopgap measures. One day, possibly centuries from now, or millennia even, things are going to fail. There are going to be so many holes in Komarog that the demons will eventually start flooding through in such numbers that containing them will be impossible. Dark Eldar society lives on borrowed time, and they know it. They simply wish to enjoy their remaining years as much as possible. And finally, we shall talk a little bit about the real space raids I've been mentioning occasionally. So, obviously, they need to raid real space to get various resources. They can grow and manufacture a whole lot of things in Komarog, but raw resources are a rarity inside the webway, obviously enough. So they do need to raid for basic materials. They also need to raid for slaves, and on some occasions food, but they can grow most of what they need inside of the webway. And energy? Not really a problem. Komarog is more than vast enough to contain any number of power plants, enough to power the entire city. And even then, you only really need to power the important parts, where the important people live. Whether or not the peasantry have to live in darkness, well, who actually gives a shit? But the slaves, now that is always important. And remember, they require a certain amount of them simply just to not become soul dead, which also means that they have to stock up upon slaves to be tortured essentially the same way that a human civilization might store grain to outlast a harsh winter. And not, of course, to mention the appetites of Dark Eldar society. They want lots of slaves all the time, and as such they have to raid practically all the time. Now, a raid is a major undertaking. It will require several ships, require hundreds at the very least, and usually thousands of soldiers. Here's the thing. The Eldar will not launch a raid they are not entirely prepared to carry out to its successful conclusion, which means making damn sure that they have overwhelming superiority in every way possible. The Dark Eldar do not take risks when it comes to their own lives, for obvious reasons. This means that when a Cabal is organizing a raid, it can take months, even years, to organize all of the ships, the captains, the soldiers, the various sergeants, the officers, finding the correct target, organizing the strike itself on said target, etc., etc., etc. Not to mention bringing the provisions, bringing the regenerative equipment, bringing the homunculizers, bringing the ammunition, bringing weapons, armor, spare parts, supplies, yada 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 yada. It is a full-on military expedition that additionally also needs to bring enough storage capabilities to actually haul off the prisoners they are hoping to take. It is a Herculean undertaking, and it is far from uncommon for several Cabals to work together to organize a real space raid. Whilst in Komarog, you will practically never find two Cabals working together. Vect doesn't want that, because that means somebody might build a power structure to rival his, which he considers to be a very, very bad idea indeed. In real space, however, the need to get slaves, and to do so relatively safely, outweighs the need to control the Cabals. And as long as everybody understands that you can be allied on the outside, but not on the inside, then everything is fine. Besides, the naturally untrustworthy nature of Dark Eldar mean that even the strongest alliance outside of the Dark City is unlikely to last for long once they return home and need to start discussing how to share the spoils. And so, with the preparations finally done, the real space raid can commence. Now, the Dark Eldar will pick a relatively undefended area. They very rarely go after anything that can fight back unless it is of supreme importance. For example, they might dedicate themselves to a large-scale raid on a heavily fortified system if they can get a reward worth it. For example, psychic nulls, which is one of the most precious commodities in all of Komarog, since literally the city's survival relies upon them, but these things are fairly rare. They will pick a relatively undefended area, preferably without a naval presence in any way, shape, or form, and preferably with as little of a ground defense presence as possible. Isolated mining worlds, for example, are perfect targets.
Mining worlds.
They've grown particularly fond of picking on the Tau, because generally speaking, while the Tau have a fairly rapid response military, they do tend to be relatively thinly spread, and they tend to concentrate mostly on their outer borders, assuming that nobody can hit them at home, an assumption that the Dark Eldar have been punishing them for quite a lot recently. Then, when a target is found, they will spend usually a week or two simply just poking at the target, launching terror raids, and making damn sure that the population centers they are targeting know that they are there. Because, of course, the more afraid the population is, the more suffering and pain the Dark Eldar get to feed upon. This is a calculated risk. They will want to continue this terror campaign for as long as possible, while inflicting as little real damage upon the population as possible. They want to kill a couple percentages at tops. They don't want to actually inflict any large-scale damage to the population, which is one of the reasons why they don't really like using any kind of saturation bombardment. That kind of stuff is only used in the most dire of circumstances, or when they really, really need to make a point. But of course, they are also entirely aware that every day they delay, something nasty could show up. There are several Space Marine chapters, for example, who have a strong dislike for the Dark Eldar, and will hunt down any lead they can find that might suggest where they might strike next. The Salamanders in particular are not fond of the Dark Eldar, and the feeling is most assuredly mutual. As such, the Dark Eldar want to stay just long enough to not draw attention to themselves, but also long enough to make the planet's population nice and scared and ready for the reaping. Then, finally, when the last stage begins, they will try to capture as much of the population as possible. They don't mind injuring them heavily in doing so. They have more than enough medical technology to stop them from perishing, shall we say. After that, the captured population will preferably be placed in stasis, because that way they can't fight back. But this is only really an option for the largest and best organized of cabals, since of course stasis chambers are rather difficult to produce. Lesser cabals might have to rely upon simple bulk haulers. This is a subpar solution because these ships are generally speaking not particularly nippy and fast, which could present a very large problem indeed, seeing as after having spent a couple weeks on the planet, well, there is every chance that some unbidden guests might show up.
Forbid they show
but,
up.
Of course, it's again a question of greed versus practicality. A bulk hauler will drag a lot more slaves back home to Komarog, but it will do so less safely, and with a slight bit less quality. The uncomfortable thing about humans is, we tend to get used to practically anything. Even the heights of terror will essentially just become background noise if exposed to it for long enough. So there is also a degree of haste in all of this. They want to get back to Komarog as soon as possible, not just because they're afraid of retribution, but also because their cargo will essentially spoil.
Yeah.
Not to mention, of course, if you're going to be dragging 1 million slaves back home to Komarog, that is going to require 1 million slaves worth of food and water and all of the other necessities that a population might require to not fucking die.
Yeah,
since, of course,
the
corpses are, well, they're not completely useless. But in the Dark City, they can be made into drapes and other wonderful playthings, but they are, of course, far, far less valuable. Yep. And there you go, I've taken something as relatively awesome as a space pirate slave raid and boiled it down to fucking logistics.
Nice.
I'm gonna start using that term now. Fucking logistics. Anywho, that has been my video on the Dark Eldar. I've touched upon most of the interesting parts and given you a good overview of what Dark Eldar society is and who they are. There are still several things that I'm going to touch upon in their own videos. The Homunculi is probably going to get their own. Lilith Hesperex is definitely getting one. Azradul Vect also, obviously. And I might do a bigger video as well on the Dark Eldar raiding process, describing in detail the various stages and how they carry them out and for what goal, etc. That, of course, is going to be topics for another day. Until then, I have been Arch, thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good
You too,
day.
Arch. End the video. Well, that was the Dark Eldar video from Arch Warhammer, and this was requested by Ideal Bigots. If you want to go check out more of Arch's stuff, there is a link in the description. If you aren't watching him, go check out his stuff. It's very informative, especially when it comes to Warhammer. There are other videos on his channel, though. So, go check him out. As far as what I learned in this video, okay. Well, I already knew about the Dark Eldar torturing. And I already knew the existence of the Dark Eldar. I already know some basics about the Eldar in general, and quite a bit of their history from other videos. But what I learned was, what was it, comrade, community in the webway. I did not realize that the webway was falling apart at this point. I did know about the soul-eating part, but I did not know that they could extend their souls by torturing. I did know about their acute feelings. Did not know about them continuing to have a way of bringing people back from the dead. I know that apparently they had a way back in the day using the warp. And so this is something like that. Then we learned about the cliques that were in the community, the city itself, all looking for power, it seems. And then the witches' stadiums, where you can go get your fill of torture and misery and all that. We learned about the natural born ones, and apparently they're producing tons of them in factories otherwise. And we learned about the raids to get more slaves because, well, you gotta have people to torture. So this is all great information that I'm learning for the first time. My thoughts on it. Heaven help us all. There you go. That's my thoughts. If an enemy such as this, whose only interest was to play with us at first, and then hit us with overwhelming power, just to load us up and take us away to keep us alive for a long time through a whole lot of torture and pain and misery and unusual craziness. Yeah, heaven help us. Heaven help us all if something like that happened. Um, but I think that's all I'm thinking on it. Um, sorry about all the switch ups in this video. The dog was going nuts. The trains have been going nuts. This last 13 minutes, I believe, roughly, maybe a little less, is me on a different day because I had to stop recording. Because it's just long and there's a lot of interruptions, and I can't avoid all these interruptions. But I think I'm gonna leave it at that. Willie, out.
If you like the video, stay tuned for more content. And as always, feel free to comment. Have a good one.